Welcome in everybody to another edition of my roster review series with a look into the Edmonton Elks, a team coming off a very disappointing last season and is looking to turn the corner. But really quickly before we get started, if you want to support the channel, as always, be sure to hit like and subscribe down below. I really appreciate it, everybody. And with that said, let's talk about today's agenda, starting with the Elks 2021 recap, talking about what happened last year. Then we're going to talk about their 2022 coaching staff, and then going into their 2022 positional rankings, where every position on this team stacks up relative to the rest of the CFL. And then we're going to go into the starting lineups that I've pieced together. And then finally, we're going to go into the team award predictions and a key storyline to look out for this team this season. And with that in mind, let's talk about their 2021 season. And it's a forgettable season, honestly, for the Edmonton Elks last year. 0-7 home record, 3-11 overall. One of the worst seasons that I can remember the Elks ever having. I really can't remember the Elks ever being last place in the CFL. And to make matters worse, they even lost both games versus the Ottawa Redblacks, who were seen as this putrid team last year. So really forgettable season for Edmonton. They had very high expectations going into the year. A lot of people, including myself, picked them to win the Grey Cup, and they fell flat on their face in every way possible. So this resulted in them cleaning house in the front office and coaching staff, and ultimately it was needed after what was one of the worst seasons in franchise history. Now let's flip over to this year, starting with their coaching staff. And what else can you say but Chris Jones coming back to Edmonton, the last head coach that has led this franchise to a Grey Cup back in 2015. He's just back, and a lot of familiar faces as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the roster, but Jones, I think is going to really breathe life into this organization once again, and I already think he has, just because he brings a sense of legitimacy to the table, even though I know people really don't like him personally because of, the history of him leaving jobs pretty early, but ultimately he is a good football coach, and he knows how to coach defense, and I think he's really going to get the most out of this defense and this roster this season. And he brings with him Stephen McAdoo, a very experienced offensive coordinator who was the offensive coordinator in Saskatchewan in 2019, and they ultimately let him go in favor of Jason Moss, who's a very experienced offensive coordinator as well. But I think that Cody Fajardo played so much better under Stephen McAdoo than he played under Jason Moss. So I think that is a big consideration. He is going to bring a lot of experience to the table, and I think this is going to be the real stabilizer for this team this season. And then finally, special teams coordinator Merritt Bowden to round out this unit. So I think this is going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. Chris Jones is, of course, the GM for this team as well, and is obviously the defensive coordinator as well. So, he's wearing many hats, and he's going to have so much influence over this team and the future of the next couple of years here. Now let's start talking about this roster, starting with the quarterback position, which is going to come in at 9th in the CFL, and the questions are all over this unit. This is frankly one of the first times I can remember that I really don't have a read on who is going to be the actual week 1 starting quarterback for a CFL team like this late in the game. So, there's several candidates still left here, and really Mike Beaudry, I'll say right now, is not really a candidate for this. It looks like he's making a position change, so it's really a 4-horse race at this time period. So I couldn't say for sure who do I think is going to be starting next week for the Elks at quarterback. So we'll start talking about the candidates, starting with Nick Arbuckle, who is the most experienced member of this group. And he's a pocket passer who generally excels on short to intermediate passes. What Arbuckle doesn't provide, unfortunately, is very high upside, as he doesn't possess really any play extension ability or game-changing arm strength. However, his advantage, like I said, is that he's the most experienced quarterback of this group by a wide margin. So really excited to see if he's the guy that ultimately emerges here. And then Taylor Cornelius, a tall, big-armed passer with athletic potential. He still appears to have a ways to go in terms of playing the mental side of quarterback at the CFL level after his appearances as a rookie and previous pro experience that he had in the XFL with the Tampa Bay Vipers. Even when you take into the fact that he was a rookie last year, some of his decision making was just putrid. Some of the worst I saw in all of the CFL last season. And even though he had some good games where he put up some nice yardage and made some nice throws, he made a couple of really bad mistakes, head-scratching mistakes every game, and I think that's really what's going to kill him when he ultimately starts games in the CFL. And then you have these three rookies here, starting with Trey Ford, a Canadian quarterback who's a dynamic athlete at the quarterback position, who was the 8th overall pick in the first round of this year's CFL draft. Ford was a 2-time OUA MVP while at Waterloo, bringing energy into a program that was really in the dumps a decade ago. And honestly, as the highest drafted Canadian quarterback in 40 years, he will be a major storyline going into this season. And maybe he's not expected to start, but even the fact that he's going to have a role at all on this team is potentially very exciting. And then another Canadian quarterback here, Mike Beaudry, a 6'5" Canadian passer from the University of Idaho. And like I mentioned just in the beginning, he actually looks like he is making a position change to fullback, but I still list him under quarterback here because the Elks do on their roster. So we'll see what his impact is this season. Clearly a guy willing to take sacrifice for the team. And then Kai Loxley, another athletic type. He played his college football at UTEP, the University of Texas, El Paso. In addition to his athleticism, he also has a bigger 6'4" frame, and his highlights, honestly, I've checked them out. Pretty interesting guy, and I'm excited to see what he can do. He actually did look really good from what I hear in the preseason game, the other day. So that rounds out this unit, and, it's all really up in the air who's still going to start for this team this year. I don't really know. We'll talk about my official prediction for what is going to happen in the next few days and when they name the starting quarterback at the end of the video when we talk about the projected starting lineups. Now looking at the running backs, which are going to come in at 3rd in the CFL, and I think you have a couple of really intriguing players here, and obviously a superstar in James Wilder Jr., who's a bell cow of a running back with a vicious running style. Wilder was just excellent in 2021, being the biggest bright spot on a terrible Elks team. Some of his runs were simply highlight reel worthy, consistently breaking tackles play after play. He also continues to be an effective receiving outlet out of the backfield, which has always been a strength of his game going back to his days with the Argos when he was Rookie of the Year back in, 2017. And he is one of the most dynamic running backs in the league today, simply said. And then Canadian Ante Milanovic-Litre, a hybrid between a running back and a fullback type. He's a player that has seen action as a ball carrier, a receiver, and on special teams the last few seasons with Calgary. While I don't personally see him as a starting option, he is a useful player to have on the roster with a high special teams floor and the ability to pick up the blitz in passing situations. And then a very intriguing player, Walter Fletcher, a player who flashed in a few starts at the end of last season. He looked incredibly elusive and showcased the ability to make defenders miss in space. Fletcher is definitely a candidate to have a breakout season if Wilder misses significant time due to injury. And then these last two guys, not too significant here. Martese Jackson, a return man for most of his career, not really too much of a factor on offense. And then Tanner Green, mostly a fullback type. So I think you have a superstar running back in James Wilder Jr. and Walter Fletcher, who I think can be a star in this league if he gets a consistent run of playing time. Now looking at the rookies in this unit, starting with John Paul Seemakinda, who's a 6-foot running back from the University of Ottawa, who is the 7th round pick in this year's draft. He was actually listed on the depth chart at linebacker for their preseason game, so I wonder what's going on there. Chris Jones, very famous for changing positions of players. And then Kevin Dubois, a 5'8" running back from the University of Montreal. Alex Gale, a player who came through the Canadian junior system for the Edmonton Huskies. And then finally, Terrence Roberts, who played his college football for Central Oklahoma. Now moving from the backfield to the wide receiver position, which is going to come in at 9th last in the CFL. And frankly, I just have too many questions about this unit. I think you have a lot of guys here that have proven themselves in the CFL, but haven't necessarily had their best seasons lately. I do think there are good players, and there's one undisputed superstar really in this unit, but I don't think the depth is all too good. You're relying on a lot of older players here, I think, and the Canadian depth really isn't that good either. But that being said, I do love Kenny Lawler, a bigger-bodied receiver with the speed to burn defenders down the field. Lawler had an incredible 2021, leading the league in receiving yards while helping the Blue Bombers win their second straight Grey Cup. Lawler was the major offseason signing this year for Edmonton and is going to be looked at to be a difference maker for this unit. However, I'm not completely sure that he will be as effective for the Elks as he was with the Bombers, largely because the difference in quarterback situation. It's also worth noting that last year was a major breakout season for Lawler, meaning that defenses will likely shift more coverage his way this year. Regardless, he should still be the best target in this offense, as his ability to create big plays in contested catch situations is desperately needed by this unit that is going to be relying on a relatively inexperienced quarterback room. And then you have Darrell Walker, who was formerly thought of as one of the best receivers in the CFL and had an underwhelming 2021. On a few occasions, you saw that Walker still could be a difference maker by breaking tackles after the catch or winning a contested deep ball, but most of the time he frankly looked disinterested last year. He is a player that the Elks look to still be relying on heavily this year, so it will be interesting to see if he really has a big bounce back and, has more of that effort in fighting for passes that are thrown his way. He was one of the most targeted receivers in all of the CFL last year. And then you have a potential breakout guy in Jalen Tolliver, a bigger-bodied receiver who was a bright spot as a rookie in 2021. Tolliver saw a decent amount of targets last season, including a breakout game in Week 15 versus Saskatchewan. He quickly established the ability to win in the red zone, which you always love to see, and I'm excited to watch him this season. And then Canadian Mike Jones, who is an experienced guy who offers a solid replacement level floor, but not a ton of upside, I would say. Much of Jones' production last season came in just a few games, but he did still show some ability as a field stretcher. And then Shai Ross, an athletic young receiver who broke into the starting lineup in 2021. Ross is most famous for a few viral videos such as dunking an Oreo, but he took that buzz that came from that video into a strong first season as a starter. He is a yards after the catch threat who is best utilized in the slot, in my opinion. And then Emmanuel Arsenault, a very experienced receiver who was out of the league in 2021. Arsenault is one of the best receivers of the last decade in the CFL, but he looked like he was running out of gas in 2019 with Saskatchewan when he last played. Let's see if he can make this team and make a contribution this season, but I'm not going to make any predictions. And then Jalen Marshall, a receiver that has been around the CFL the past couple of seasons with Hamilton, but hasn't received a consistent run of play. For what it's worth, I liked a few of the plays he made at the end of the 2019 season with Hamilton, but just too small of a sample size to really take anything away there. But he is a good athlete, and I believe he played at Ohio State. And then Caleb Hawley, another CFL veteran that was out of the league in 2021. He last played with Ottawa in 2019 and wasn't particularly impressive for them there, if I remember correctly. And then Charles Nelson, who's mostly a factor as a kick returner during his career, occasionally start at receiver, but hasn't been much of a factor when he's gotten those opportunities. And then a trio of Canadians at the bottom here, starting with Danny Vandervoort, a former high draft pick in the CFL draft, I believe it was 3rd overall, who has mostly been a special teams guy. However, I do believe he scored a couple of touchdowns last year, and I don't believe he scored a touchdown before last season, so congrats to him, and he's sticking around in the CFL. Maybe he makes a breakout season and makes good on that potential he had when he was drafted so high. And then Chris Osikusi, originally a 4th round pick in 2019 out of Windsor, who appeared in 5 games last season but didn't record a catch, so mostly a special teams role for him. And then Rashawn Simonize, an athletic raw receiver who has been given starting opportunities but has failed to make the most of them, honestly. And that's probably why he has moved around the league as much as he has. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of guys that you're relying on in this unit that may have already played their best football in the CFL. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about Kenny Lawler. I think he's right in the midst of his prime. But I think the depth in this unit, like I said, a lot of questions about it, but I think maybe Darrell Walker has an excellent season this year and it outperforms this ranking drastically. Now looking at a trio of rookies that are still in camp as of the recording of this video, starting with Gavin Cobb, who was the 4th round pick in this year's draft out of Manitoba, was a guy that rose out of the combine process, was really good in the one-on-ones, really showed off a good amount of smooth route running, and I'm really excited to see what he can do. I believe he started in their preseason game in their opener. And then Raphael Leonard, who was signed by the Lions in 2019 but never played a game for the team. And then Pharaoh McKever, who is a 6'6", 260-pound receiver who was a tight end during his time in the NFL. So maybe he's a future Nick Lewis, who knows, but we'll see what happens with these guys. Now let's take a look at the offensive line, which is surprising to probably most people that they're going to come in at 4th in the CFL, but they secretly have a couple of really good blue chip players here and a lot of experience that they're bringing to the table this season. They quietly rebuilt this offensive line this season. So we're going to start talking about him with Tony Washington, a veteran tackle that brings consistency in pass protection. He's a guy that really doesn't waver too much on a week-to-week basis. Maybe he's not the most high upside guy, but he just consistently displays a very high level of play, and he's had trouble staying healthy in recent years, but he did play in 12 of 14 games for Montreal last season, so that's a good sign that he can still, stay healthy here in his mid-30s. I believe he's like 36 and one of the oldest players on this team. And then Mark Cordy, a major free agent signing from Ottawa who brings the versatility to play tackle, guard, or center. Cordy was a very high-performing member of a terrible Red Blacks offensive line the past 2 seasons and will be surrounded by much better pieces here in Edmonton, which should really help his, ability to shine as one of the best offensive linemen in the league. And I'm really interested to see where he slots in along this Elks offensive line. I believe he started the first preseason game at right guard, but he has experience, like I said, playing left tackle, center, and I'm excited to see what he does this season. And then David Beard, one of the team's longest tenured players who anchors the offensive line at center. He continued his steady play last season where he operates as a well-rounded lineman. If there's a knock on him, I saw him take a few really stupid penalties at times last season, and he'll need to clean that up, but overall, just a very solid week-to-week offensive lineman that's been one of the best offensive linemen on the interior the last few years in the CFL. And then Colin Kelly, a veteran tackle who missed all of last season with an injury. Kelly brings a lot of starting experience to the table and was one of the league's top right tackles back in 2019. I think he's going to be kind of a secret addition for this team because everybody kind of forgot he was around this organization last year because he was out the entire season. You plug him into that right tackle spot, and I think he's going to be really good for this offensive line. And then Thomas Jack Cardila, Edmonton's first-round pick from the 2020 CFL draft out of the University of Buffalo. He started a few games at the tail end of last season, and I would expect him to get a little bit more run in 2022, potentially as one of this team's starting guards. And then Steven Nielsen, a global from Denmark who was originally a first-round pick by the Elks in the global draft. He started a handful of games last season at right tackle and didn't look completely out of place with the team's first unit. Probably not a guy you want starting day one this year, but he looks to have potential as one of the league's top global players. And then David Foucault, who's a longtime veteran capable of playing a little bit of guard and tackle, but has struggled in my eyes the past 2 seasons. He was one of the worst pass protectors in the CFL in 2019 and wasn't much of a factor last year in Montreal in the games he started, so I'm not expecting much from him here. I believe he did start their first preseason game, so take that for what it's worth. If he's going to be the opening day starter at one of the guard positions, it wouldn't surprise me. And then Chris Gangarosa, who dressed for his only career regular season game last year in the regular season finale versus BC. He was originally drafted in the 6th round in 2020 out of Wagner College. And then finally, you have Cole Nelson, who is flipping from defensive line to offensive line this year after struggling as a rookie on the defensive line. He was Edmonton's first-round pick last year and was seen as a guy that was a little bit overdrafted, but we'll see how it goes for him on the offensive line. But overall, there's just so much experience in this unit. I think that Cordy and Beard have the potential to be blue-chip guys in this league. I mean, they've already proven at times in their career that they've been blue-chip offensive linemen. And then I think you have 2 really solid tackles, which not a lot of teams in the league have. A lot of teams have, a good starting left tackle, but then the right tackle has been kind of a question right now, or vice versa. Hamilton has the opposite problem, but you get what I mean. And I think Colin Kelly will provide that, secret ingredient for this offensive line to succeed this season as one of the best in the CFL. Now in terms of offensive line rookies, starting with Mark David Bieniemy, the third-round pick out of Fresno State this year, who only played in a few games his entire college career at Fresno State. However, you just have to look at his measurables to see why he got drafted where he did. He's 6'5", 350 pounds. And then Peter Cortes, a former 2021 fifth-round pick out of St. Mary's after starring for the team at the guard position. Tyler Clucas Warren, another draft pick out of St. Mary's, who stands at a hulking 6'7", 330 pounds. Emmanuel McGirt, a born and raised player out of North Carolina who played college football for NC State. Brandon Smith, a tackle out of East Carolina who also participated in shot put while in college. Nicholas Sumach, a 6'8", 335-pound lineman drafted out of the University of Saskatchewan. And then finally, Antonio Garcia, a former third-round pick in the NFL draft by the New England Patriots, so he's very notable here, and he looks to reshape his career north of the border. So we'll see if any of these guys play a factor this year. Now let's flip over to the defensive line, which is going to come in at 8th in the CFL, and ultimately I just don't think that this group has a designated number one pass rusher like a lot of units right now have in the CFL. There's just not one guy I think is just going to be that game-wrecking difference maker on a week-to-week basis, but we'll start talking about him with Jake Ceresna, a veteran defensive tackle who has been an all-star in this league in the past. I would say he was one of their better players on defense last season, pushing the pocket from the inside, but ultimately I don't think he's a superstar player from that defensive tackle spot. And then Canadian McConnell Henry, a run-stuffing defensive tackle who doesn't bring much in terms of pass rush upside. He's that classic player that you ask to take up space in the middle of the defense and take on double teams. He comes over from Saskatchewan where he spent the last several years, so we'll see how he does. He's very familiar with Chris Jones from Chris Jones' time in Saskatchewan. And then Thomas Costigan, a bright spot for the 2021 Elks, who produced 6 sacks despite only starting in 5 games. I really liked his versatility as a pass rusher, as he has the capability of lining up on the edge or inside due to the fast get-off he has at the snap. I'm looking forward to seeing if he earns a full-time starting role this year. And then Christian Rector, a 270-pound lineman that is a bit of a tweener on the defensive line, but had some solid production in the action he saw in 2021 as a rookie. And another interesting thing about Rector is he played his college football for the USC Trojans. And then Claudel Lewis, a recent signing who was out of the league in 2021 but provided some good quality snaps in 2019 with BC. Lewis will mostly be a factor in run defense, where his 300-pound frame allows him to stand strong. And because Lewis and Henry are pretty similar players, I think they're going to be very easy to rotate in and out on that defensive line. And then S.A. Maraburi, a former high draft pick who has bounced around the league as a rotational lineman in his career. He was recently brought in here by Edmonton after being cut by Ottawa. And this is the second time I've talked about him in this year's series, which might be a channel first. I don't think that's happened before. I'll have to double check that when I have the time, but pretty funny there. And then Jordan Reeves, who hasn't played in the league since 2018 with Saskatchewan, where he was a standout special teams player, but not much else. And then these last two guys, nothing too notable. Kingsley Apara, who played in one game back in 2019 with Toronto, but hasn't played in a CFL game since. And then finally, Daniel Ross, who played in one game for the Rough Riders way back in 2016, but has had some time in the NFL since then, playing for the Raiders, Jaguars, Cowboys, and Texans. So a lot of interesting guys here in the defensive line room, but ultimately, like I said, what holds this unit back is that absence of that game-wrecking defensive lineman that a lot of other defensive lines in this league have. Now let's look at the couple rookies that are still in camp on the defensive line, starting with Jacob Plamondon, who is the surprising second-round pick in this year's CFL draft out of the University of Calgary. He tested incredibly well in the movement drills at the Combine, but wasn't incredibly productive during his time in U Sports. And then Jamin Pelly, this team's selection in the supplemental draft, who is listed at 6'6", 320 pounds, though it is widely believed that he's much heavier than that. It will be interesting to see how the Elks deploy him, as not too many guys at that weight have been successful in the CFL, so we'll see if he's going to play on the offensive line, defensive line, where Chris Jones is going to use him. But ultimately, a couple of interesting Canadian rookies to look out for. Now looking at their linebackers, which are going to come in at 9th in the CFL, and I just think there's a couple of major question marks in this unit. But you do have one really good player here in Dion Lacey, who is going to patrol the middle of the defense for this team. I wouldn't call him one of the elite linebackers in the league, though he is very good, but he's familiar with head coach Chris Jones' defense from his previous stint in Edmonton. So ultimately, I do suspect he'll have a very productive year. And then after him, though, I just think there's a lot of questions about inexperience and who's actually going to start at these spots. So Niles Morgan, a second-year player who was a full-time starter as a rookie for the Elks last year. There was some good and some bad for the young linebacker, but we'll need to see more to really get a better idea of what he's going to be as a CFLer. It will be interesting to see, though, if he can hold on to a starting position here. I believe he played a lot of the middle linebacker position last year. Can he slide over and play the weak side, or does Lacey slide over and play the weak side? And then Matt Elam, a former first-round pick in the NFL draft years ago by Baltimore. He has some previous experience with Chris Jones from his time in Saskatchewan back in 2018. I'm not completely sure if his role will be at strong side linebacker, but it wasn't entirely clear who to put in this spot, and Elam has a background at safety, so you usually see guys with that kind of background put in at strong side linebacker, a little bit more physical. And then Toby Antigua, a versatile CFL veteran who can play a little bit of defensive line, as well as dropping back in coverage as a linebacker. Antigua doesn't really excel at any one thing, which is why he's bounced around the league as much as he has. However, he's a match made in heaven for Chris Jones, given his desire for versatile players, and that's where he really played his best football in his career. And then Adam Konar, who comes back to the team after a stint with Edmonton from 2015 to 2018 before spending the last 2 years in BC. He's mostly been a special teams factor the past few years, but has some starting experience from earlier in his career. And then Matthew Thomas, who played in one game for Edmonton last year, don't know too much about him. And then Malik Tyne, who's a second-year player who played in a special teams role last season. He's listed at linebacker here, but he actually played some defensive line in the recent preseason game, so watch out for that this season. Now let's take a look at their linebacker rookies, starting with Wesley Apollon, who attended Tuskegee University in Alabama with his twin brother Woodley, and was selected in the 5th round of this recent CFL draft. And then Nate Edwards, who was a late-round pick in this year's draft out of McMaster, who had a productive 2021. And then Cortez Sapp, a former Tennessee Volunteer who spent some time with the Titans in the NFL. So we'll see if any of these guys really make an impact this year and end up starting games or contributing on special teams. Now looking at the defensive back room, which is going to come in at 8th in the CFL. And I think there's a couple of good players similar to a lot of units on this team. But I do think there's just a lot of questions beyond that, and you really don't have really any experienced defensive backs really beyond the first couple of guys here. So starting with Aaron Grimes, who is a very experienced CFL halfback who had a strong 2021 in coverage. Grimes has really good instincts and has a really good feel of when to make a play on the ball and isn't afraid to make a tackle either when necessary, and is overall just one of the most consistent players on this team. And then Ed Gainey, who comes over from Saskatchewan in free agency. He's another veteran with experience playing for Chris Jones, and he's long been one of the league's top playmakers at the position. He had another really good season last year with Saskatchewan, but he's getting up there in age at 31, so you worry a little bit about that when he's going to fall off. But, overall, I think you're pretty comfortable with him going into this season at one of your halfback spots. And then you have Nafiz Lyon, who's a young corner who got a good run of playing time at the end of last season. He will be a player they will be counting on this year as one of their likely starters at corner, with not a lot of guys that have actually played in CFL games before on the roster currently other than him. And I'm really excited to see what he brings to the table. He had a couple of interceptions in the limited action that he had last year. Look really good, just need to see more there. And then Duron Carter, a player who has had an interesting career path, establishing himself as an all-star receiver before being out of the league in 2021. He then signed with the Elks this offseason with the intention to use him in the defensive back room, where he was used occasionally during a stint under Chris Jones in Saskatchewan. So very interested to see how this experiment plays out for this team. And then Scott Hutter, a core special teamer who hasn't really gotten an opportunity to contribute on the defensive side. Mike Dubison, a veteran of 4 CFL seasons who last played in the league in 2017. And then finally, Nate Hamlin, who has 20 games of CFL experience but hasn't played in the league since 2018. So a couple of guys like that. But overall, after Grimes and Gainey there, I just have so much questions about this unit, and overall that's what drags it down in this ranking. Now, they do have plenty of defensive back rookies in camp, starting with Enoch McConzo, their first-round pick out of Coastal Carolina, who was very versatile while in college, really did everything for Coastal Carolina. And because of that skill set, he seems like the rare national that can play strong side linebacker in the CFL, so I'm very interested to see where he slots in and how Chris Jones intends to use him. And then Aladotin Akatepe, originally born in Nigeria, he played in youth sports for the Guelph Griffins and was selected in the 4th round in 2020. And then Jeremy Dominic, a 6th round pick out of the University of Charleston, where he was named a second-team All-Conference as a senior. And then Kenan Clark, a 2021 6th round pick out of Ivy League school Cornell. Trey Hoskins attended Weber State as well as Lincoln University before coming to the CFL. Malik Saunier, a former standout at Midwestern State, a school in Illinois. Jawan Taylor, who played his college football for the Florida Gators. DeQuaylen Thomas, who was named to the Conference USA All-Conference team in his senior season at Southern Mississippi. And then finally, Javonte Dean, a former Miami Hurricane who spent some time on the practice roster of the Saskatchewan Roughriders in 2019. So a lot of names here. We'll see if any of these guys are notable in this defense this year. And then finally, taking a look at their special teams unit, which is going to come in at 7th in the CFL. And you have a really good kicker here with Sergio Castillo, but I'm not sure what else you really have here. Gregory Hutchins, the punter here, I don't know if he's actually going to be the day one punter. No idea what that situation is in training camp there, but I don't really know what they're going to be doing with their kick returner situation as well. Charles Nelson has a lot of experience doing so, and he's still on the roster this late into camp. So he could potentially fill that role, but even so, I don't think he's an excellent kick returner. And ultimately, I think it's an okay unit, but I don't think it's one of the better units in the CFL. So you put all the rankings together, and the Elks, unfortunately, are going to rank pretty low on both sides of the ball, 8th on offense and 9th on defense. But I will say coaching is going to play a bigger factor for this team than I think any other team really in the league, just because of how many players and new players they have this season on this team. So I really don't know how those questions across this roster are going to be solved. I mean, there's just so much turnover this offseason, so ultimately that's why it's going to rank at 9th in the CFL for me on defense, and obviously the quarterback questions are going to be the main detriment to the offense here. Now let's talk about how those players that we just talked about could potentially slot into the lineup, starting on offense, and we'll start with the quarterback competition here, and I'm going with Nick Arbuckle to be their day one guy, just because of that experience factor is usually what wins out in the CFL with a very unfamiliar game to most quarterbacks. So I think Arbuckle is going to be the day one guy. I really don't trust Taylor Cornelius at all, but not completely certain of that. It definitely could be someone else, but we'll see what happens. And then on the offensive line, just the one question, David Foucault, I think he's going to start the season, but ultimately I think he'll lose out to a guy like Thomas Jack Cardila by season's end. I just think, Foucault has played his best football in the CFL. And then in the receiving room, I just have questions about where they're going to start their Canadians for the most part. Are they going to start 2 Canadian receivers? I have them starting 2 Canadian receivers, but we'll see what happens with those guys. Gavin Cobb is a guy that's really impressed during training camp as a rookie and could potentially start in this receiving core as a Canadian. And then Jalen Tolliver, I really only underline him just because of the lack of experience, him only being a second-year guy, could potentially get beaten out by a better guy as a new coaching staff comes in here in Edmonton. So that's the offense. Now looking at their defense, and the question here, starting on the defensive line, I don't know who's going to play that second edge position. I think Costigan will play the other side, but Rector, I have position there. Guy that played quite a bit last year, but didn't start too many games. Maybe is given a bigger opportunity, but who knows? Chris Jones bringing in specific players for his defense. Don't know how it's going to line up. And then in the linebacking core, the couple of questions here. Niles Morgan, again, wondering if he's going to hold on to that weak side linebacker job or if he's going to stay in the middle linebacker spot or Lacey's going to move over to the weak side linebacker spot. Interesting to see how that works out. Lacey's obviously going to start, though. And then Enoch McConzo at the strong side linebacker position, which I didn't list him as a strong side linebacker. I put Elam there in that spot, but ultimately I could see them starting McConzo at this spot or somewhere on this defense because of the ratio situation on this team. Not a lot of great Canadian starting caliber players on this defense, honestly, and they're really lacking probably in terms of Canadian receivers as well. So overall, just not a lot of great starting caliber Canadian players on this team, and that McConzo may be forced to start in this defense. Not that he isn't an excellent player, but pretty rare for a guy to make an impact right away. And then, of course, in the secondary, you wonder if the Deron Carter situation is going to work out for this team. I mean, everything's up in the air with that guy switching to a new position this late in his career. And then Javonte Dean, who I plugged in at that cornerback spot. I really don't know who's going to start at that last defensive back position, but Dean has been on practice rosters the last few years in the CFL, and we'll see what happens with him. So those are my questions about the defense. Now let's take a look at the team award predictions, starting with most outstanding player, which I think is going to be James Wilder Jr., running back for this team. Going to be their engine on a week-to-week basis on offense. I think they're going to be that classic defense first, ground and pound on offense, and I think James Wilder is going to really carry the load for this team. And then most outstanding defensive player, I think Deon Lacey's going to have a big year in the middle of the defense, have upwards of 100 tackles, put together some sacks and interceptions as well, and be a very productive player for this team. Could be other players as well, though. And then most outstanding Canadian, I'm going with Mark Cordy, and I'm also picking him to win most outstanding offensive lineman as well. I just don't think that this Canadian depth on this roster in terms of their starters are all that impressive. Maybe there could be a couple breakout guys, but ultimately I think Cordy is the best Canadian player on this team, and those are my team award predictions for the Elks this year. And then finally, let's talk about this team's key question, and it's ultimately not going to surprise anybody. Who emerges as this team's quarterback this year? It's a major question. You have so many guys that entered training camp. 4 guys remain really for that potential starting job. I mean, a couple of those guys are rookies, but in a competition this open, who knows what's going to happen. I did say Nick Arbuckle probably opens the season as this team's starter, but not confident in that really in any sense. And then Taylor Cornelius, who I believe started their preseason game last week, but ultimately I just don't have too much faith in him either. Inconsistent player, and I'm very interested to see how this ongoing question gets solved this year for the Elks, and ultimately if they can find a solid starter under center. But that is going to be the end of today's video, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the show, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Hussey's Huddle for more CFL content just like this. I greatly appreciate it, everybody. And with that said, be sure to let me know in the comment section what you guys think about the Elks this year. Are they going to be a playoff team? Who's going to start at quarterback? All of that. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.